Welcome, everyone. Fantastic seeing you all again. As we always do, we'll give it a couple of minutes here to allow people to trickle in, but thank you all for joining at the top of the hour. Promise to get us going here in about a minute and a half. But thank you all for joining. I see we have 23 people here and more joining, so great to see you all again. See the numbers going up here. The Dow. So we'll give it another minute and then we'll get started. So with that, we'll get going here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you again. My name is David Rubia. I'm a program management officer in the unit plastics unit, and I'll be moderating today's session. So would like to let you know that we want to get to know each other, see who's in the room. As you join, if you could put your name, organization, and which national project you're working on. If you could put that in the chat, it would be great so we can see who's with us today. And before we get things going, as always, just to remind you that we are recording this session, so this will be available for you. This will be shared after the session, so the learning that will be from here will be with you for life. So don't worry about that. So with that, I'm pleased to welcome you to the second Plastic Reboot webinar on sustainable finance. We did have the fiscal policy webinar, and now we're having a deep dive into blended finance. To recap for any watchers here, that this is a Plastic Reboot project is a JEF-funded integrated program targeting the upstream and midstream of the plastics life cycle in 15 countries. The program is led by UNEP and WWF in collaboration with UNDP and UNIDO. So as mentioned, our focus today is on blended finance for circularity, a topic that is on everybody's lips now that's working on circularity, is money and how to be innovative about it. So blended finance is a term we hear more and more, and it's a concept being explored by several of our Plastic Reboot national projects. In today's session, we'll therefore want to explore what it is and what is needed and its benefits and of course its limitations. So to do that, we'll begin with a framing presentation by Mr. Matthew Fraser, who's the Director of Research and Programs at TCI. You will remember him from the first webinar on finance. So he'll be setting out the foundations of blended finance. Matthew and his team have been working with Plastic Reboot countries to analyze their financial landscapes, identifying financial instruments already in place, looking at key investment streams, as well as their readiness for blended finance uptake. So just a reminder that the Plastic Reboot Working Group is scheduled tomorrow, and their TCI will be focusing on identifying barriers that can limit private investment in different contexts and determining the right blended finance approaches to tackle those. So that will be a more engaged conversation where you can get your hands dirty in the topic. We do encourage you to join that session. My colleague Jonas should be pasting in the chat anytime now the links for that. Just a reminder that there are two separate working group sessions that will be held to suit your time zone convenience. Make sure you suit the one that works most for you. Following Matthew's presentation, we'll have a really interesting panel discussion with two distinguished speakers. I'll just quickly introduce them. Our first panelist, he leads Little Introduction in Development Finance Circles. We have Professor Ugo Panizza, who's a professor of economics and Pictet Chair in Finance and Development at the Geneva Graduate Institute. He also heads the Department of Economics there. He has spent his career at the intersection of academic research and development policy, previously as Chief Debt and Finance Analysis Unit at UNCTAD, and as a senior economist at the Inter-American Development Bank. He holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins University, sorry. But most relevant for today's conversation, Professor Panizza recently published a working paper, The Catalytic Effect of Blended Finance, which gives us one of the clearest theoretical frameworks we have for understanding when blended finance actually works and which instruments deliver the most value for public money. So we're looking forward to hearing from Professor Ugo and learn from the ideas in that works. Our second panelist, we're also very excited about. He brings a solid on-the-ground practitioner perspective. Mr. Vishwas Vidyaranya is the CEO of Ambire Global, which is based in Bogota, Colombia. He has 15 years experience in sustainable finance and implementation of more than 25 sustainable finance taxonomies across Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and beyond. And the interesting thing is that many of those countries overlap with our plastic-free food program countries. So tomorrow the working group should be quite engaging with experiences that he shares today. He's also working with over 75 institutions, including banks, insurers, pension funds, on translating those taxonomies into actual financial products. So we're really excited to hear about this. Welcome, Vishwas. Thank you. So we will leave some time at the end for questions. Please post any you have in the chat. We will try and get to those after the conversation here with our panelists. With those opening remarks, I'd like to turn over the floor to Matthew to set the scene for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Really appreciate the very kind introduction. I look forward to spending the next 15 minutes or so really giving you a kind of grounded introduction to what blended finance is, hoping to answer some of the fundamental questions. So, what it is, how it works in practice, how it's structured, and crucially also giving you some perspective on what it does really well, but also what it can't do. I will try to keep this quite rudimentary because we do have a great panel lined up who really actually do have a lot of expertise in this field, and I would really love to defer to them to provide you with a lot more deep insights into how blended finance can support us on Plastic Reboot. But without further ado, I'd love just to get into it. Maybe just drawing a little bit of a link from the last webinar. So the last webinar that we held back in May was about fiscal mechanisms. For those of you who don't recall, a fiscal mechanism is really sort of any sort of price signal, any policy with a price signal. So think of a tax on a single-use plastic or an EPR scheme, which is designed to collect funds and redistribute them to various companies who are doing more sustainable or circular product design. Fiscal mechanisms as a whole are really intended to correct the sort of base price signal in an uneven market. So again, thinking of a tax or a subsidy, it's really about price correction. That being said, corrected prices rather are not automatically going to add up to investment. They're not the same as an investment or providing capital. So why is that? There are a number of challenges. So plastic circularity projects, companies, especially in emerging markets, face a number of additional barriers that are adjusted, that an adjusted market price can't solve alone. So if you were to step into the shoes of private investors and actually encounter what they look at when they encounter plastic circularity companies, ultimately, what they see is a sector that nobody has really successfully invested in at scale before. So there are a number of things that immediately come out as being quite apparent. So one is the risk perception. Investors might suspect that people, when it comes to a refill model, might actually just steal or keep empty bottles. It's a very new way of doing business, and there's a risk there. And that would be quite a hefty challenge to the business and could even lead to the fundamentals of the business model even collapsing. Oftentimes you have just a mismatch in ticket sizes. So a shop may need something like $50,000 for washing equipment or other sort of equipment. But big investors are typically dealing in the kind of $1 million plus range. Other things include kind of no track record. So a lack of a proven business model would be deemed a lack of a track record. Also, things like weak demand, customers buy a refillable bottle once, but ultimately would switch back to the kind of single-use scenario. And finally, even the valley of death. So a startup can run out of money right after testing its first local store, long before they could even afford to launch citywide as well. So the main question here, when encountering these risks, is how do actually we address these risks to secure an investment and ensure that our ambitious projects and solutions actually get off the ground. And that's really where blended finance comes in. So maybe first, before we even get into the concept of blended finance, let's just step back and look at the different types of money, otherwise known as capital. There are different types of capital. And I think it's useful here actually just to conceive of this as a continuum rather than a binary choice. Often you hear kind of public sector capital, private sector capital. In fact, there are many gradations between them. So if you look on your screen, on the far left, what you have is purely public capital. Think about government budgets, official development assistance, multilateral climate funds. Oftentimes here, there's no financial return expected or a very small one. It definitely sub-market. Whereas if you contrast that to the far right, you have purely commercial capital. So think of banks, private equity, investment funds, and these organizations very much run on the fact that they expect healthy market or even above market returns on their investment. So in this case, blended finance isn't really a specific source of capital. It actually sits here, as you can see now in this orange box. It's a mechanism to really pull capital from across this spectrum into a single structure. So really, it's a way of structuring capital rather than a source itself. Why is it so important? I think the kind of unique selling point here, actually just going back to the previous slide, because it's able to combine different types of capital into one bucket, it's able to combine different risk tolerances. So the risk tolerance of public and philanthropic funders with also the scale of commercial to unlock transactions that neither side necessarily could do alone. So it's a way of tapping into these different types of funding. So just as a key takeaway here, blended finance isn't the money itself, it's the architect. It's the way of structuring the money. And if we go on to the next slide, I can offer you a formal definition. So the OECD defines blended finance as the strategic use of development finance for the mobilization of additional commercial finance towards sustainable development. That's a bit of a mouthful, but I think I would draw your attention to kind of three words in that definition that really kind of carry the most weight. The first one is strategic. So this is not just accidental co-financing. Blended finance is an intentional structuring that is really deliberately designed to bring in commercial capital that wouldn't otherwise come by itself. Mobilization, so the commercial capital has to be additional. If a deal were to have happened anyway without a public contribution, that really wouldn't be a blended finance deal. It is a subsidy for something that that did not need subsidizing. Finally, additional. I think this is the key one for me. The development finance really must trigger new private investment that wouldn't have existed without it. So, for example, if the commercial capital would have invested on its own terms anyway, the development money added wasn't really of added value. It was just giving a discount to an investor who was basically already prepared to make that investment. So there really is this concept of additionality that sticks out. I think this also brings us to what blended finance is not. So it is not about stacking grants. So it is not about layering multiple public commitments without a commercial investor. You really need that kind of combination of both. It's also not a new source of capital. The money comes from funders that already exist. And it is not a mechanism for making marginal projects viable by throwing enough public money at them. These projects, and I think this is important for this audience to hear, is the project really has to be at a sort of near bankable state to begin with. So this isn't a sort of Hail Mary. The project really needs to be in quite healthy condition in order to seek or to secure public finance or blended finance. Maybe on the next slide, what I'll do is just really try to make this easy with an example. So let's just imagine a refill reuse business. It needs $300,000 to get off the ground. And luckily, we have a development funder. So think of a donor, a philanthropy, or a climate fund that's able to supply us with $100,000 of that capital. So 1/3 is already committed through a development funder. Luckily, their goal is impact, so it's really not about financial return. What they're able to do for us is offer us a low interest loan. This is also known as concessional capital. So we have $100,000 in our bank that is now actually used primarily for the purposes of leveraging to bring in another funder with larger capital. And now what we're focusing on is getting that commercial investor through the door. So in the next step, the commercial investor really wants to expand his or her circular economy investment portfolio, and they see that we already have $100,000 on the table. They feel actually quite confident with this, that some of their concerns about the risk of our business are actually addressed. They feel that there's enough there to invest in this, where likely before, without that $100,000 on the table, they probably would have overlooked this opportunity. So the result here is we have a development funder with $100,000 that was able then to leverage an existing $200,000. The result is a $300,000 total investment, which we can call a blended finance deal. Now, just a technical point here, and I'm sure this is going to come up in the panel, the mobilization ratio here, or the leverage, is 1:2. So for every dollar of public money that has been invested, we have $2 of private capital that was attracted. There's a lot of talk about getting the mobilization ratio just right. I'm going to save that for the panel, but I know that there's some interesting discussion there. But just for you to know that this is a concept of, how much commercial funding can we leverage from that initial public funding. Great. So I think maybe what I can do is dive a little bit deeper. And again, I would still try to stay a little bit at the high level, but I really do want to give you a sense of who are you going to be talking to? How are these blended finance deals structured? So I hope to give you a bit more detail into actually how the blended finance structure is actually assembled into reality. So I think if we can actually use an analogy of building a house or a building, it actually is quite a useful analogy to understand the why and how of design of blended finance. So first of all, to know, blended finance itself is, as I said, it is the design of finance. So if you were to consider blended finance to be the architect, that architect can actually do a very bad job and waste a lot of good materials. So if you have access to the finest steel and concrete, you could still produce a structure that collapses. Similarly, if you have access to concessional capital and the commercial appetite, and still design a blended finance structure that doesn't work, that's often because the instrument doesn't match the specific risk barrier, or the layers are being sized wrong, or the sequencing is off. So bear with me with this analogy, and I hope to kind of walk you through the different steps of this. So I think first thing to know is indeed blended finance is organized into layers, otherwise known as tranches. And these are often based on risk and return. So you can kind of see the orange arrow there with losses going from first to last. You have different investors occupying those layers. So if we look at that first layer here, we have a junior investor. The purpose of this junior investor is actually to absorb a lot of the first losses in exchange for a higher potential reward. And they serve quite an important role here because they're protecting the other investors. So for example, if we imagine this is sort of the foundation of the house, you have a philanthropic funder committing $50,000 or agreeing to first loss capital first. So they would take the majority of the risk first before anyone else signs. The next step here is what we call a mezzanine investor. So these are investors that would agree to a moderate risk, and also
Matthew, sorry for jumping in, but cognizant of time, we're cutting it close to the panel. So sorry to do that, but we might need to wrap. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, David. No problem. I can run through this. So we have a middle investor basically taking moderate risk for moderate returns, and on the next one we have senior investors taking the lowest risk but also the lowest returns. In this way, what we're able to do is stack both risk appetite and financial contribution, but then obviously when the repayment comes, so when the investment is recuperated, the repayments are flowing in the inverse. So the commercial capital, the senior investor would get paid out first, followed by the mezzanine investor, and finally the first loss junior investor. I think this is also just a way, so on the next slide, and I can run through this relatively quickly, what I wanted to do was also introduce you to who you will be talking to. So these are the main kind of stakeholders that you would encounter in a blended finance deal. Just for the interest of being a little bit quick here, we have concessional investors, so think of development finance institutions, MDBs, commercial investors, which are banks, funds, private equity, intermediaries, so managers and facilities, and also investees, so the enterprises and infrastructure operators. And then, of course, what we have in the kind of darker orange box here is kind of governance and policymakers. They're not capital providers, just a quick word on that. Their role is twofold. Actually, they're pipeline builders, but also they are really architects of the enabling environment. So actually building the regulatory framework, the standards, and the incentive structures that would actually make a blended finance solution possible in the first place. So I think on the next slide, I'd love just to wrap up with some closing thoughts. Really where blended finance adds value, but on the flip side, some limitations. First, on where it adds a lot of value, I think it really does a good job at crowding in, or let's say bringing in, commercial capital into models that are near bankable. So right at the margin of viability, again, no moonshots, but really doing a job to kind of bring near bankable projects to life. It's absorbing very specific and identifiable financial risks. So the risks that I talked about before, track record, small ticket sizes, default risks. And it also creates demonstration effects. So the first blended finance deal in a sector lets the second deal close on better terms, and the third deal even on better terms. So it's a way of actually kind of building a market that is actually quite underappreciated. Finally, just a few quick words on what blended finance can't do. It cannot fix a weak enabling environment. So if the regulatory framework is uncertain, if the EPR legislation is not operational, blended finance is not going to fix that. It also can't create a pipeline that doesn't exist. That's really what project preparation is for. It also can't substitute for weak institutional capacity. So actually very similar to the enabling environment. And finally, probably this is the point I really want to most carry into the panel discussion, and touching back on that leverage ratio. It's not necessarily a success metric in itself. Harder markets often produce lower ratios by design. So a program operating in a frontier market should actually expect a lower leverage than one operating in near efficient markets. So that doesn't mean that it's failing. It just means actually that it's doing harder work. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very excited for the panel. So David, I'll hand it back to you to do a quick introduction to the panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Very, very, very thorough. Actually, really nothing to add. I like that you've summarized everything there in the last slide. I will quickly transition to our panel because I'm sure we have a lot of foundation now. And for that, I invite our two panelists, Professor Panizza and Vishwas. Please join me here in our virtual room. I'll quickly start with Professor Ugo with a simple yet important question. Private capital is flowing into environmental priorities in emerging markets, but not yet at the scale needed. From your perspective as a development economics, what are the main conditions that need to be in place for scaling these capital flows? Is it mainly about addressing risks, returns, policy certainty, or something else? Professor Ugo, over to you. Professor Ugo, if you can hear me, you're still muted. Sorry about that.
Sorry, thank you. And after many years, we still have the muting. It's a bit of everything, right? So certain projects simply don't generate enough private returns. And so these are projects which are not suitable for blended finance projects. You know, they might be very valuable, but they just simply don't generate income. Among the projects that generate income, the main issue is risk in two parts, right? Risk tends to be higher in developing emerging economies for many reasons, because these economies are subject to larger shocks. There is more policy uncertainty, but part of it is actually not real risk, but it's a very high risk perception. So actually, investors tend to think that these projects are much riskier than what they actually are. And there is recent research based on the GEMS data set, which is coordinated by the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, that shows that indeed this is the case. They actually, they have data on a very large portfolio of projects, and they show that bankruptcy rates are relatively low, and even when there are bankruptcies, recovery rates are relatively high. And so projects are not as risky as people think. So a lot of it is actually risk perception, which is higher than actual risk. And here is exactly where public intervention can step in, because by providing guarantees, you can reduce risk perception at basically no cost, because if risk is actually not there, then the guarantee is not wrong. So these are my 2 cents.
Thank you so much for that. That was very concise and succinct, and something that speaks specific to me. I know we talk a lot about perceived risk, and I like what you said. Public guarantees can be able to cover that at no cost, because there will be no failure and therefore no drawdown. Fantastic.
Or little cost.
Or little cost.
That's no cost. It's a bit of an exaggeration.
There's no free lunch. Correct. Vishwas, over to you. So you've sat across from the table from banks and pension funds and insurance companies across emerging markets and tried to get them to finance sustainable projects. How does Professor Panizza's framing compare with what you see in practice, and what would you add from the investors/market side? Thank you.
Thanks, David. I mean, I would like to build on Professor's remarks and also what Matthew mentioned in the beginning. When the investors are looking at these projects, especially plastic circularity projects, I mean, first point of evaluation is they look at it as traditional business models, in the sense that the projects need to be viable. So that's something which is important. Where blended finance typically comes in, or that's what we've seen, is if you have a very strong business model, but you say, okay, in the first couple of years or in the first year or so, we are going to have losses. So can we have someone come in to take up these losses? or if you have new technologies that you want to put into the market, or new systems, or different things which the market has not tested, but you have a strong business case. So that's when it comes in. And on the risk side, I think I would like to build in, because that is something which is very common that we hear. It is a perception, definitely from the credit side, but also in a lot of cases, the project from a project point of view. You also have a lot of risks in place, whether it's legal risk with compliance, environmental permits, economic risks, because a lot of these projects also depend heavily on economic incentives and subsidies, and long-term contracts and market viability. A lot of these things also come into play. So if you think from an investor point of view, for example, if I have $100,000 to invest, and if I can invest it in an easy project, such as, for example, solar or other renewable energy, and I can get a good IRR, why would I invest the same money in a project which has way more complexities, right? So that's where the whole part of blended finance comes in, and also looking at what stakeholders can actually come in and push the market, push the boundaries a little, to finance these kind of projects. So that's something which is important. And another point which I think was touched upon is the ticket sizes. It's true, unfortunately, that the larger the project volume or the amount, it's easier, and you also have more instruments once you have, I don't know, more than $10 million. $10 million is still not very big, but 25, 50, it becomes way more attractive. But then the challenge is when you have smaller instruments, then smaller ticket projects, then you need to aggregate a lot, because the cost of transaction itself of structuring a lot of these become high. So that's why it might be useful to get aggregators, or show a business model in phases where you have in a long term you need $10 million, but right now I need $1 million, and how do I structure this? So that those are some aspects that we've seen from the investor side.
Thank you so much for that, Vishwas. So definitely seeing, it's flowing from Matthew's presentation, from Prof's intervention in yours. I like what you've touched on in terms of risk that's associated with legal risk, economic risk, and issues with subsidies and things like that. Those are things that work in the first conversation about that you do need the foundational environment in place, and this is not a substitute for that. So I see this interconnectivity, and you've introduced an interesting conversation on the need of this ticket size and the need for aggregation to be able to handle the high transaction costs. So these are all really interesting tidbits that are coming up here. So I'd like to turn back to Professor Ugo. So blended finance is often presented as a way to use public/concessional capital to unlock private capital. But your research suggests how it is designed matters greatly. So especially building on what Matthew presented, what do you think in terms of how we can better design blended finance to be able to unlock private capital using public as concessional capital? Thank you.
So so I have mixed feelings about blended finance. So let me start with this. I think it can be a powerful tool, but I also think there is a lot of confusion about it. That's why I wrote the paper that you kindly mentioned at the beginning. To me, for those of my generation, they probably remember when, 25, 30 years ago, microfinance came out, right? There was a lot of excitement around it. And, microfinance would solve poverty, would solve all the problems, and, all this sort of stuff. And there was a lot of excitement. And then when people started doing research about it, well, the picture was much more mixed. It helps sometimes it doesn't, but it clearly, it's not the silver bullet that is going to kill poverty. And, it seems to me that in blended finance, we're at the stage which we were in, microfinance 25 years ago. There is basically no academic research on it. So if you search the literature, there are basically 3 academic papers on blended finance. It's all gray literature, which is great, but many people who write about blended finance, they have an interest in blended finance. So maybe it's not as, there is a massive lack of transparency. So Samantha Attridge and collaborators have a paper about this in which they try to get data, and data are very hard to get. So I think it's a tool with a lot of potentials, but well, I'm in the business of doing research, so I'm gonna say we need more research on it. So let me give you an analogy, and then I'll tell you what I think. An analogy that has nothing to do with blended finance. It's about food. So now, to survive, we need nutrients. We need vitamins, we need proteins, we need micronutrients, we need all this sort of stuff, right? So in theory, we could just assume pills, which give us all this sort of stuff, and we could live perfectly well. Now, cooking actually mixes this stuff and makes this nice and everything, and it worked very well, right? So we all survived the human species thing, but there are counterindications. Counterindication one is that cooking is victim of its own success, so we end up eating too much, so more than what we need. So now the problem in big part of the world is obesity, is not lack of thing. And it's also, if you think about it, it's inefficient, right? It would be much more efficient just absorbing this stuff, but it's good. So think about blended finance. In theory, in a perfect world, so if you think about the presentation of Matthew, projects needs a bunch of stuff. So if a project is not commercially viable on its own, it might need some guarantee, it might need some subsidy, it might need something. And in theory, if market were perfect, we could just put this stuff together and stuff would happen. And now, for a reason that I think Matthew explains very well, this is not going to work because markets are not perfect. And so blended finance is some kind of a way to address this market imperfection by mixing together this ingredient, which is good. The bad thing that what it comes out is complex and not very transparent, a little bit like food. If we take all these pills separately, we know exactly how much vitamins we would take, how much, proteins, if we, eat a plate of tagliatelle ragu, you don't know exactly how much proteins, how much starch, how much whatever you eat. It tastes good, it's great. And the fact that this thing is not very transparent and complex leads to problem. It leads to problem that might lead to bad structuring, and it leads to problem that somebody which is not the person you intended to benefit, might extract a lot of the rent from the operation. Especially when you mix, very capable and highly paid people in the financial sector with other people. So I think it's something important, but it's something that needs to be structured and evaluated carefully. And to go to my paper, and then I conclude because I've been talking too much. So the paper is kind of complex, does a lot of math, right? But it actually says two things. And number one, you need to understand what market failure you're going to try to address. But in the world, there are two important market failure. One are externalities, the fact that I'm producing something which does not only benefit me, only benefits somebody else. And therefore, I will be underproducing this because I'm not internalizing the benefit that go to other people. And this requires a subsidy. And the only way to address this is with a subsidy. And then there is imperfect capital markets. That is what I was mentioning before. The perceived risk, it's higher than what the private sector wants to take. And in this case, a subsidy is not a good idea. In this case, what is a good idea is a guarantee. And if we want to design well blended finance operation, we need to understand what the market failure we're doing, and then calibrate the structure to target this market failure. This is very easy in theory, much more difficult in practice.
Oh, thank you so much. I felt like I was back in grad school, and I like the presentation of the different biases in whoever is speaking about blended finance. But thank you so much even for the analogy. It really took it home. I want to pivot back to Vishwas to build on that. Vishwas, if I'm a project developer interested in upstream, midstream market solutions, say, for example, better packaging design, alternative materials, or reuse refill systems, what finance what would a finance institute look for before they decide to back me? So how can the right financing instrument be matched to the actual needs of projects is what I'm trying to get at here.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I mean, interesting question, but at least with some of the case studies that we have seen in Latin America in these kind of projects, I mean, these projects are the examples that you mentioned are actually challenging business models. They're not straightforward because otherwise everybody would have done it anyways. So there are couple of things that needs to be done. It's not just innovation and financial instruments or financial structuring, but also structuring the project itself. First is in terms of stakeholders, like as a developer, like what are the stakeholders, financial stakeholders that Matthew presented? Who are we going to target, right? For example, how can we break down our project costs into different aspects? Maybe a technical assistance can come in from somewhere else. Maybe there's a grant that can be a small part. And, once you have all of these built in, then you go into the commercial financial institutions to show that, okay, these are already in place. But also what works in a lot of times is you have certain impact funds, you have certain ESG funds who also have this technical assistance facilities who normally cover the cost. Most of this is kind of related to technical studies, engineering studies, design, and those kind of things, or the initial seed capital, but very small. That's what we've seen at least in the market. So that is the first thing which is important with respect to whom you're going to approach. The second is a strong business model itself. So like in any other project, it's important. But here, especially in OPEX heavy projects, we are looking at least the investors look at a lot of sensitivity analysis. Just to give you some examples, again, this might not be true across the world, but at least in Colombia and in few countries in Latin America, the energy prices have increased substantially in the last few years. It's 20% annual increase of energy costs. Also, the manpower costs in Colombia, for example, shot up 25% last year. So these are some kind of issues which affect all kinds of instruments. It's not just any specific instrument, but basically now it's increasingly being asked, to do different kind of sensitivity analysis and show your business models how robust. And finally, the last point also want to touch upon is there's a lot of greenwashing in the market as well, in the sense because every day you hear new names of technologies and new names of systems. These are not necessarily new innovations, but if you think from a financial sector point of view, so they are not necessarily technical people. So they have to first understand what is this technology, what is the system. So it takes a lot of time. So that's why it becomes extremely important to start using international frameworks or other references, taxonomies, all of these things to say that your definitions are aligned with these. Doesn't matter what you call them, what is the name of the technology, but this is what you're talking about. So that the idea is to make it easier for the financial sector to understand this technical complexities in your project.
Vishwas, I want to stick with you and build on your last point there. You mentioned the word taxonomy. It's quite a popular word in sustainable finance space. What is it and why is it in the plastic space?
Yeah, so it's basically, I mean, the whole concept of taxonomy started about 10 years ago. And today, there are about 65 countries globally who have taxonomies or in different stages of development. Basically, what it does is it translates all of these complex science or technical information into simple definitions that the financial sector can use. Simple example of what is a sustainable plastic manufacturing process can be very different depending on whom you ask. Also, if you're looking at types of plastic, right, you have eco-friendly, bio-based, oxy-degradable, biodegradable. And if you think of this from a financial sector point of view, who have no idea about what all of this means, but you just have to trust your developer that, okay, you're saying that it's eco-friendly, so I assume that it's eco-friendly. So this is what the taxonomy tries to avoid, in the sense it doesn't matter what you call it, but this is what science-based definition of what is green, what is not green. Second thing is it avoids this market fragmentation. I mean, if you're a developer, if you have to go to 10 different impact funds or DFIs, just imagine everybody having their own definition of what is sustainable, what is green. So you'll have to do 10 different documentation. So the idea is to kind of harmonize these definitions, avoid greenwashing, and that's what actually helps increase flow of preferential capital, international capital. It kind of reduces barriers to these flow of capital, at least in the technical definition space. So that's why it's been increasingly being used. It's also becoming a regulation in a lot of worlds. So yeah.
Thank you so much for that. You've really done it in a very simple way. I want to pivot back to Professor Ugo because we've said a lot of things today. From Matthew's presentation, we've talked about what blended finance is, what it's not, the need for the enabling environment to be there. It's not a band-aid. It won't fix that. We need projects that are near ready for investment, not startup, not moonshot projects. And here we have the Plastic Reboot program. And we want to hear from you what success would look like for programs like Plastic Reboot. One of the things that was mentioned earlier is that how much you leverage should not be used as a metric alone. So here we're curious, co-financing mobilized is an important metric, but what else should we be looking at to understand whether finance is helping circular solutions to scale? So what are the broad things that we should look at and to gauge success or not for programs like this? Thank you.
So let me start by saying that I know nothing about plastic reboots, so it's very hard for me to tell you much. So well, and now I know something because you invited me to this thing, but till a few weeks ago I knew exactly nothing. So it's hard to say something specific about Plastic Reboot. But let me pick on something very important that you said and that Matthew said at the beginning. Success should not be evaluated by looking at multiplier effect or catalyzing effects. I mean, conditional other things. So if you have two projects which are the same under every possible aspect, one that mobilizes more private finance, it's better. That's fine. But this is valid only if the projects are, the same under other aspects. Before I mention projects which generate large positive externality. So there might be projects that generate large positive externality, which might be, suitable for blended finance operations. However, this is something which I discuss in my paper, but it's not really something new. This really comes from anybody who has ever taken a course of basic public finance would have studied this. The level of private capital mobilization is inversely related to the size of the externality that I'm going to address. So projects that generate large externalities, other things so equal, will mobilize less private capital. Is this a bad thing? Not necessarily. If the externality I'm addressing, it's an important externality, it can still be a good idea. So it's hard for me. So I'm going around your question, David. Sorry. So it's hard for me to give you a precise answer what success looks like. But I think it's very important that success should not look like I mobilized a lot of private capital. It should be, I mobilized a lot of private capital and I was able to solve the problem I was trying to solve. Because if you just mobilize a lot of private capital, that's the thing. That's maybe, so that's one thing. And the other thing is something should be transparent and evaluated by independent third party. The most successful social program ever devised, it changed name many times, but it was called, the original name was Progresa. Was a conditional cash transfer progress in Mexico, devised by a great economist called Santiago Levy. And the great intuition of Santiago Levy that made the program sustainable and successful, in fact, was adopted by every single government, Mexican government after him. They just changed the name to claim that it was their own program. So, it went from Progresa to Contigo to whatever. and then was copied around the world, was that Santiago built it with a built-in scientific evaluation done by an independent party. So I think success should be based on this kind of independent evaluation. Again, I'm an economist who does research, even I don't do this type of research, so I'm biased, but I think it's very important.
Thank you for the treatise, and the fact that you acknowledge your bias reduces your bias. There's something that you did mention earlier about we need to be very clear about what market failure we are trying to fix with blended finance, and so it seems to me that also metrics that are associated with whatever it is that we're trying to fix would also be something that we need to keep track of, because it feels sometimes like we're trying to track things that are parts of the solution and not necessarily the overarching objective. I want to switch. We have 9 minutes here. I want to switch to some of the questions in the chat. I see a question from Mpoi. I hope I said that correctly. I'm going to try and digest that question. It's a very long question. Hopefully I don't over digest it. And I'll push it back to you, Professor Panizza. The question here essentially is, has blended finance ever actually worked for plastics? And if it has, are we better off adding plastics into funds that already exist? Or instead of building a whole new one that just adds up competing with climate and water for the same money. And this is also learning from the example you gave of microfinance. I really liked that one because we've seen this happen before. We have this whole new exciting opportunity for increasing investment in sustainability, and then later on we find that that we need to be a bit more pragmatic and cautious in how we're approaching it. So sort of digesting that question down into that is,
So, well, the answer, whether it ever worked for plastic, the answer is that I don't know.
Yeah.
But I'm going to say something a bit more provocative that, and maybe many people will disagree with me. I think at this stage, we don't have hard evidence that blended finance ever worked with anything. That doesn't mean that it didn't work. Maybe it worked, it's fantastic. But I'm not aware of any scientific evaluation of a blended finance program. Exactly like if we had gone back in 1995, there was no scientific evaluation of a microfinance program. So that's what I know. I might be wrong, but that's what I searched the literature. I couldn't find anything.
Thank you so much for that. And because it's a very complicated question, Vishwas, do you want to take a stab at it as well?
Sure. Maybe I can give a couple of examples, not necessarily blended finance in a traditional way, but there was a multi-million-dollar bond in Colombia with a commercial bank and a investor from Luxembourg, focused on circular economy. And the challenge was basically, once you have the bond put in the market and you have multi-million-dollars raised, the question was, how do you find projects? And how do you measure circularity, right? So that was also a challenge. So what we started doing with some of the commercial banks here is basically they access a technical assistance facility to provide kind of free technical assistance to their clients. It's free in a way, but the actual reason is to basically look at opportunities for investments, evaluate circularity, and to see where you can put in the finance per se. So that's one example, which is slightly closer. And the other one is in Mexico, where we are trying to work with the DFI, who are actually bringing in guarantees, like you mentioned, Professor. So basically there, it's not really additional benefit per se, but it's basically de-risking your projects a little because you have a DFI coming in with this. And so there are some examples which are working. In terms of competing, yeah, it can happen. Actually, a lot of these thematic instruments, if you see, it's all also about rationale and how you position it. The same project can have an effect on climate change mitigation versus circular economy versus pollution. So it's also on how you put your narrative in place and what funds you want to access. Yeah.
Thank you, Vishwas. And I want to close with takeaways from each of you, but because I have you on the screen now, just a quick 1 minute, if that takeaway from the whole conversation we've had today for our national, just for the benefit of our national project teams and policymakers, something that they can carry with them. Just, one overarching takeaway that from your perspective, and then I'll turn to you, Professor Panizza, for the same, so he gets the benefit of free thought. Thanks.
Thanks. I'll be very short, but basically, like I said, it needs to be innovation and not just finance, but also in project structuring. There are a lot of stakeholders and a lot of new kind of investments that are in the market, like Matthew also mentioned. So the idea is, as a project developer, we often see that we tend to go for traditional commercial capital, and the idea is, to explore these opportunities because a lot of times it works, and of course, on a small ticket projects, these things get complex, and the cost of transaction might be high. But if you can try to aggregate and do this innovation in structuring and finance, I think that we've seen a few examples of where it has worked.
Thank you so much for that. Professor, over to you for your last takeaway.
So my message for policymakers is that this is something exciting. I think there is a lot of possibility to do interesting things, but it should be evaluated and transparent, especially if public money are committed. I'm kind of driven crazy by the fact that in many things, there is public money committed and their use is not transparent. And it's in many fields in international finance. But
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. You both really wrapped it up really well for us. And we have managed to keep time. We have 3 minutes to go here. I want to just conclude here, first of all, by thanking our panelists. You've kept us really engaged. I've rushed you, given you little time to answer, and you've been able to give us bite-sized introspect on blended finance. And thank you, Matthew, also for the really good overarching presentation at the beginning there. I also want to thank my colleagues and partners from TCI. So Idun, Jonas, Essa, Gemma, Varun, and Michael, thank you so much for putting this together. And thank you all for joining. We've had really high numbers for today. So if you have follow-up questions for our panelists, Jonas will post their contact details in the chat. They've been kind enough to be available for follow-up engagement offline, and I think it's something that we will take advantage of. Save the date for the next Plastic Reboot webinar. It's scheduled for the 10th of September. It will be on plastics policy in cooperation with RAP. We do encourage you to join the working group sessions. I made a mistake. I need to clarify that now. It's on Thursday, 23rd July. So not tomorrow. It's on Thursday, the 23rd of July. There'll be registration links in the chat with the 2 different time zones. So keep track of the time zone that works best for you. As I mentioned earlier, in those working groups, our colleagues from TCI will take us through a session building on this webinar. I'm sure there's lots of follow-up questions and lots of follow-up engagement on this with the insights gathered. And so the different Plastic Reboot countries will be able to engage in those working groups. So it's an excellent opportunity to meet and exchange with other practitioners and experts working on a range of different financial mechanisms, including blended finance. So hopefully you're able to attend those, and hopefully they're able to nourish you. With that, I want to thank you for your time. Really engaging series. This one was Professor Ugo Panizza. Vishwas, thank you so much for this, and have a good rest of the day. And I bid you Godspeed in making a blended finance or any finance flow to plastic circularity. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
bye, thank you.